from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are going to present to you a 2-week series about general education. Throughout the United States today, there's very serious discussion at colleges and universities across the country as to what that is and what we might do in reforming or changing that program as we attempt to enhance education for all our people. On the first program, I would like to suggest that we will entitle the question, what is general education? When we come back on part 2 of this series, we will discuss the identifying, the defining, and the application of general education through abilities and the levels of those abilities and their application. I'm very pleased to welcome to the program 5 of my colleagues from North Idaho College who have worked for many years on this topic of general education. They all serve on the North Idaho College General Education Committee. But I would like to add that what we deal with today is most pertinent to colleges and universities throughout the Northwest, the United States, and even other countries, because those principles that are looked at here are also being looked at other institutions. First of all, welcome to the program Terry Jones, who's from the Music Department of Idaho College, and Mr. Jones has been with us before, but we're happy to have you back on this subject.
Nice to be back, Tony.
And next to him is Joyce Leiter, who is from the English and Foreign Languages Department of Idaho College, and she too has worked for a very long time. And Ms. Leiter, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And our third guest is Lorene Belmont from the English Department of Idaho College, and I should add she is the chair and has been for a number of years of the General Education Committee, and it's a pleasure to have you, Ms. Belmont.
Thank you.
And next to her is Jim Mcclure, who is from the Philosophy Department at North Idaho College, and he too has worked very hard in this area, and welcome very much. And thank you for being here, Mr. Mcclure.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
And our fifth guest is Edwina Stowe, and she is from the Math Department, and she too has been a long member of this committee, and we welcome you, Ms. Stowe.
Thank you.
And now that I've been very formal, as my colleagues, I'll call you by your first name as we proceed through this. Lorene, we will start with you as the chair of the committee, and we know that what has been asked on this campus and across the United States, other campuses, is to get us going in that process, what is general education? Both for educators who are watching and also those who are interested in the subject that are not in education.
Generally, I think, Tony, that we consider general education to be a series of experiences both in the classroom and outside of the classroom that are helping to structure students' attitudes and their skills and their knowledge. And our question is kind of, what will this person be able to do when he or she leaves NIC?
Well, I really hear you saying that what's going on in the classroom is very, very important, but also it extends beyond the classroom. And can I take that to mean beyond the classroom, on campus, and also in the daily life of those persons?
We hope that all of these things transfer. For instance, we've read a lot of information about what people in businesses expect of their students, and many of our general education ideas contribute to that. They want to have employees who know how to communicate. They want them to be able to solve problems. They want them to have some idea about the human race and the people that they're going to be working with. So these address all of those issues, and yes, you learn about them in class and out of class.
I have one more follow-up question. A lot of our viewers, when they were students in college and they were being advised and getting counseling, would hear about you need a liberal arts education, you need a broad education. Is there any significant difference between describing a liberal arts program and a general education program?
Well, I think that we use the liberal arts concept, but I think we've carried it a few steps further because we are asking students to be able to make connections between all the things that they do, so that what you do in a math class not only is useful in math, but we're looking at mathematicians then who can make that valuable in some other field.
So taking another step than just the exposure of ideas of liberal arts. Terry, I will proceed to another question with you as we're trying to edify our audience about this question. I would ask you, how did North Idaho College become involved with this general education reform movement that is happening other places? That for many years at North Idaho College there was less emphasis on getting so focused on general education.
Well, I think, Tony, it's part of a national movement that started, as you said, several years ago, and with different studies of the success or the non-success of higher education, people began to examine that. And one of those people, as well as some of our other colleagues on campus, happened to be Dennis Connors, our academic dean at the time. And he involved some informal workshops, which then became more formal and basically charged a group of faculty members to identify what it means to be an educated person. And as we started to try to define that, we got into a variety of different kinds of concepts. Traditionally, I think the general education has been thought of as being a kind of a student's ability to pick a variety of different classes under what they call a cafeteria plan, so many social science and whatever. And we felt that it was necessary to try to see more connections between those, because when a person goes out in life, as Lorene alluded to, they don't do, science at this moment and math at this moment. It's all integrated. So we tried to define an educated person in a more integrated way.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, and one of them is, I keep hearing, as a member of the faculty myself and involved with you in this, we hear over and over the core curriculum in relation to the general education. Could you explain to our listeners more about what is the difference between the core curriculum in relation to general education and other courses in the menu that students have an opportunity to take at an institution?
Well, as we looked at what we did at NIC, I mean, we had such a variety of different students who come to NIC for a variety of different purposes. And we certainly don't want to, it's difficult, I guess, for us to deal with the one student who comes in and says wants to learn word processing. So what we tried to address ourselves to were the students who came into campus looking to get an associate's degree of arts or associate of science degree, and then that we could then talk about the core of their experience here. But we certainly at this campus don't want to negate the other kinds of courses and the other kinds of needs that people come on campus with.
But for those persons that are getting the associate and many going on to get the baccalaureate or maybe even a graduate school, you are saying that they need a certain number of core courses before they can get that degree, whereas a non-degree goal-oriented person would not have to have all of those.
Correct. And I think part of what we're trying to address is the idea of courses. I think in the past has been their experiences and knowledge, and a knowledge base in which we feel our students need to go on. Some of those students are going on to get a baccalaureate degree, but others would go into the workforce, and some of the same core experiences that we feel aren't just dedicated to four-year degrees, but to be just a good citizen in society as well.
And one final question to you. What is the rationale for general education?
I think the rationale is just that we are somewhat changing the philosophy. I mean, I think if you look at the information delivery system that higher education dealt with for the last 20 years, what we're really trying to do now is talk about how can we enable students to enable the learner. The one analogy I like to use is, instead of teaching about science, we want to teach students to do science, to be scientists, the process of doing these things, as opposed to just about. Parker Palmer, a scholar from the East, from the Eastern United States, came on campus and was pretty instrumental in getting us to focus on trying to engage students in their learning in the practical life. He felt, and I think a lot of others do, that a lot of higher education students learn about things, but they never act upon that learning, and we're trying to bridge that gap and get our students to use their knowledge.
Joyce, I'd like to move to you and ask something that's a lead-up to all of that, or a follow-up, I should say. How have educators answered this question in the past before they become so, I guess, sophisticated and more detailed? And I would even add to that, especially at North Idaho College and the experience you've had here.
I think that Terry alluded to that too when he talked about the so-called cafeteria plan. We traditionally have asked our students to choose between and among certain discrete courses, one of this and two of that one and one of that one. And I think that we've assumed for a long time that they were getting maybe the idea that there was some connection between those disciplines that they could apply. But we didn't want to continue to assume that. nor did we want to emphasize content over the abilities that we want our students to have when they leave. So we want to take a good look at those same offerings and to identify what are the abilities that cross over from one discipline to another.
And we're going to get into that next week. I hope our people will come back to watch that. But I hear you saying almost a balancing act between three things. Content has significance, but certainly the abilities are crucial to this process.
Right.
And then the abilities gives you that third opportunity to interlink between disciplines.
Correct.
That requires efforts on both the students' part and the faculty.
Correct. And I think that when we get all this put together and that a student can see what a general education is at NIC, that they be able to see more readily that there's a connection between what I'm able to do here in this math class and I'm applying the same process maybe in a humanities class or in a literature class, and make more sense of the whole picture.
Edwina, as I introduced you, you've been involved a long time, and follow up on your colleagues' comments. As you've worked on this for a long time, have you been satisfied that the criteria for creating an educated person has been met, or what else are you incorporating, or what is needed?
Well, we've looked at this, at the criteria, and as Joyce mentioned, the idea of taking a certain number of courses in all these various areas, and yes and no, they created an educated person, but we had to still go back and still wanted to go back and look at, see how it actually all fit together. So we began a dialogue with our instructors. They picked someone from each division, from each department, and asked them to meet together as a committee, and they were invited, and many of them came and participated, and out of that we had the outgrowth then of the philosophy. And then from knowing the philosophy, we went on to defining our abilities and going on to levels.
We're going to go to Jim in a moment, and he's going to address philosophy. Before we do that, when we start talking about what you just did concerning the core and what all that should be and all the disciplines, we talked about a menu.
Right.
Can that get too large, or can everyone say on campus, oh, my course is certainly a core course and it's essential to general education? Can it be too small? Can it be too large? How large is the banquet table? Terry, do you want to address that?
I think that again, it depends on what the course's purpose is to serve. And I think that's the other thing that we're trying to do with examining the courses, because certain courses, I think in my own field, a music history course that's designed for music majors would have different end results than a music history course designed for people to just have some exposure to music history. So one of the things that we've tried to do with general education is look at more at, I hate to use the word outcomes, but what do we want our students, who are the students the course intended to serve, and what are the outcomes of those courses? And so in answer to your question about certain courses, it would be hard. I'd be hard pressed to take our Introduction to Music History course and say, as it's designed today for music majors, to say it's a general education course, because it's designed for a different purpose. So
one of the things that happens when you're putting this together is it's essential at that institution to talk to experts in that discipline to find out the intent and purposes of each of those courses as you're developing this menu of the core.
I don't know if you can do it any other way. I mean, the end, what's the course trying to do at the end needs to dictate then where it plugs into the general education core.
Jim, Edwina referred to this, and all of these kinds of activities and programs have to get down to what you do.
That's right.
That question of philosophy. What is the philosophy of the general education reform movement?
Well, the philosophy is actually a document that we have created. The General Education Committee addressed the question, what is it that we expect at North Idaho College of a student who has finished our general education program? And so the rationale and the goals express what we hope the general education core allows the students to be able to achieve while they're here at North Idaho College. And what we did is we invited faculty from all different disciplines throughout the campus to come together and to discuss just what our goals were. And as a result, we came up with a document that we presented to the Board of Trustees, and they approved that several years ago.
Now, as you, and I know you've worked on it for a long time, and I'm tempted to ask a question I'm going to wait later to ask, but I know this is a long process. And as you've done this, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. You've got the general education program you're putting in place, but there's long-range planning and how it fits that. And there's mission statements at institutions and corporations. Can you just elaborate a little bit about how the mission statement is essential to the general education program? And we have one at North Idaho College that's worked on for some time, a new one.
Well, it's extremely important. That's more or less been the whole heart, the stem of our philosophy, is that the institution is focusing on student success. And so we have, through the philosophy, identified what we believe student success to be. And we ran into a problem in that here we have a philosophy, we're defining what student success is, yet how do we know that they're achieving it? These are the expectations that we have. And so after we presented the proposal to the Board of Trustees, presenting our philosophy, we realized that our work wasn't finished. What we had to do is to take a look at the goals that we had, and there were 7 goals that we recognized that a successful student should achieve. And we thought, okay, what do we want the students to be able to do, rather than just what do we want them to know? So in asking the question, what should they do, we realized that what we're really doing is that we're asking them to exemplify certain abilities. And these abilities are what we're going to be able to measure, to be able to assess. And so we got the committee back together again. In the last couple of years, we've been working on what the abilities are that they should have.
So there's a sequence.
That's correct.
There's a mission, there are goals, and you reach abilities, and we're going to get into that next week, and levels, so forth. For those viewers who don't know about the mission statement of North Idaho College, we really talk about 3 things, and you mentioned one. They're all intertwined, but that is student success, teaching excellence, and lifelong learning. Is that what general education is all about?
It certainly is. I think that expresses our philosophy very well.
Lorene, may I return to you as chair of the committee? Without us identifying them on this program, because we're going to get very specific in that, but our viewers have been hearing this word several times today on the program, abilities. Tell us something about the abilities.
Well, the abilities are the result of the goals, as Jim said. And the abilities are really what enable us to keep ourselves as faculty accountable. Because when we made an ability, we also leveled it. And by doing that, we've said there are basic levels of an ability, and they get harder. And so certain classes could have just one basic ability, the very lowest one, whereas another class could reach the 4th level, the highest level of an ability.
Can I interrupt you to say that you were talking about North Idaho College, a 2-year school. As students go on to become juniors and seniors and graduate students, and I know you've worked with some 4-year schools, we're not going to suggest today is it that you have 4 levels and then end there, that it can actually be more than 4 levels, it can get more sophisticated and difficult?
Yes, of course, but we picked 4 levels because we are a 2-year school, rather than going on to, say, 6, which some of the 4-year schools have achieved. And the idea is, if I can just give a brief example, if you take an ability like communication, then you look at all the classes at North Idaho College, no matter what department they're in, and say, do you feel, to the faculty, do you feel that you're teaching communication? And if you do, to what level? And this is where we have to hold ourselves accountable, because if we say that we do, then we have to be able to measure this. And it also means that we can, instead of identifying ourselves strictly by division, we can suddenly become cross-cultural and identify ourselves by problem-solving abilities, dealing with communication, dealing with aesthetic enhancement, all of those things. And that's the second place where we make these connections. And we hope those connections then spread out to the students.
When I was talking to you about this, you really triggered my thinking on something else. I just have to follow up on one more question with you. The temptation's too great. You indicated that one of the things that general education program can do, it can, through the teaching process, teach students that they can identify and communicate the significance of the facts in history, for example. That is an application, that some events and some facts are more important than others. Would you elaborate upon that? And even when you get a group that are of events that are significant, will this program suggest that they need to find a way to even do some priorities of that some are more impacting than others?
Yes. Can you think of examples?
Edwina? Like well, if you take your field of mathematics or the natural sciences, there have been certain events and steps and developments that are more significant than others. And how do you get that across to the students?
Well, definitely it's a challenge sometimes to get the students to recognize or to realize that there are things that are more important. And
of course, they're more used to just memorizing, rote memorization of facts.
They want to learn, right, most of them want to learn how to solve this problem and tell me so that I don't have to do any thinking myself. And what we've tried to do in many of our math classes is to focus on the problem-solving angle from it and to say, okay, how would you approach it? And there is always a variety of approaches. And then to hope that when Terry does a music class and that his students run up against a problem, that he can say, you've learned this problem-solving skill in your math classes. Now, can you apply it? Can you use it here?
And can you go on and communicate it, what you have learned, to some other group of people?
To your English teacher.
Yeah, that's cross disciplines. What you're talking about.
You know, a lot of it stems from something that I think that's been misinterpreted in the general society, and that's the idea of problem solving and being important. And if you look at the definition of problem solving, which a lot of these things are, I mean, we're talking about doing science instead of just knowing science, and talking about being a communicator as opposed to just knowing about communication. And problem solving takes into account that you learn the facts and the data and the information about the information. And if you're going to do history, if you're going to talk about how history works and functions, part of the capacity to do that is knowing the information. And I think one of the things that we've ran into is a lot of people think that we're ignoring the disciplines and their content, and we're really not saying that at all. We're just saying that in addition to that, on an equal plane with that, it's important for students to be able to use the content of those disciplines to make decisions and to problem solve within those disciplines and things. And so, again, maybe from being burnt in the past a few times, I don't want to give your viewers the implication that we're trying to do something completely different from content. We're doing things in addition to content, and the content's still very important. I mean, we have classes on this campus that they have to learn how to discuss the content. I mean, music appreciation is one of those classes that's a lot of it's done and just learning the terminology so that we can then go on from there.
What all you're doing is triggering some comments about a statement I want to make, and I'm stealing this from you. When you were talking to me, one of the statements that you made was a couple of weeks ago is that that you're suggesting that there's a paradigm shift from a teaching paradigm to a learning. Who would like to elaborate upon that in relation to what you've been just talking about?
Well,
Jim?
I think we probably all would, but I'll take the first opportunity. Learning paradigm is student-focused. And being student-focused, it doesn't mean that the teacher is going to be now the center of attention and more or less all eyes are focused on the teacher. Rather, the students are going to have to be active learners. They're going to have to be in the driver's seat of their education. So the classroom needs to be facilitated in such a way that students are working on problems, they're having to perhaps work together collaboratively or singly on these problems. And the teacher provides the information, but only in as much as it allows the students to be able to forge ahead and solve problems.
Or to help them over certain hurdles?
Certainly. For instance, in my discipline of philosophy, traditionally it's been a very, very didactic discipline where a professor lectures about what the different philosophers through time have said, and that has changed now. We see, in my discipline, a change from telling the students what the great philosophers have said to telling the students, you are the philosophers. Here are the principles, but here's a problem. Now, you apply what you know, your own philosophy and what you have learned in the course, to this particular problem. And so it's definitely changed now to where the student has to actively use what they've learned, to synthesize what they've learned, to apply that to a real life situation.
Terry?
I was just going to say, another good example of that is if you look at, so an example I just used in class, if I were to tell you information about society in the Baroque period, I could say, well, here's what it was. It was, we have the haves and the have-nots, and I could give you information about it. I think the new focus on the learner, instead what I did is I gave them pieces of Baroque music to listen to as opposed to 20th century music, and had them just talk about the differences and the changes. And I gave them things like, well, here's the performance sites. Part of what music is where you perform music. And from that then, they were to deduce what are some differences that we can see in these societies. And some of the things that you could tell them about 20th century society that they would just memorize, they've now had and actively pursued and figured out that, oh, this is what it's representing. And I think elementary teachers would call this the hands-on approach. We're letting them get their hands dirty and figuring out part of what's with those two cultures and seeing the reflection of them and then making the decision, as opposed to saying, here's this list of things that compare these two cultures.
Joyce, I don't want to give away the program next week, but because you're going to do some of that, but I know too you're another person that believes in this very deeply in the application. Can you just, without getting into the specifics of next week, tell us how you believe that can be applied?
As far as the model of the learning rather than the teaching, I teach a course in culture of Latin America, and it would be a very simple thing to stand up and just tell about this one, about that one, about the other. When the student is more actively engaged in doing the research and presenting what he or she has learned to the rest of the class, they're taking an active role, and I think that means more to the student and they retain it better.
They take on more of the responsibility.
Correct.
Of further education. I have the signal that we're out of time, my friends, but the good news is that we're going to have you to come back next week and to do part 2 of this program. And I want to tell the viewers that when we do that, we're going to talk about 3 things: identifying, defining, and applying the general education abilities. And as we do that, we look at how you level each of those abilities. In fact, we're going to talk about 8 abilities, and then through that leveling process, and then we're going to have an example of one ability and its levels, and then finally the application in a particular course in foreign language at North Idaho College. I hope you found this program as interesting as I have with our guest, and I would like to invite you back again next week when we will discuss what I've just mentioned. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of general education. For you who were not with us last week, we asked that very basic question: what is general education and what is that reform movement across the United States at educational institutions? And we gave emphasis to what is happening at North Idaho College with this subject. We are very pleased to have back all 5 guests from last week who are members of the North Idaho College General Education Committee. I first welcome to the program Terry Jones from the Music Department at this institution, Joyce Leiter from the English and Foreign Languages Department, and next to her is Lorene Belmont from the English Department, and I should add, is the chair of the North Idaho College General Education Committee. Our next guest is Tim Mcclure, who is from the Philosophy Department and Edwina Stowe from the math department at our institution. On today's program, we're going to do what I would describe as the details or the nuts and bolts of this question. I would like to really identify the program as a discussion of identifying, defining, and applying general education abilities. As we do that, we want to look at not only specific abilities that have been worked out at North Idaho College, but also the leveling of those abilities. In each case, there's 4 levels. And then finally, we would talk about the application of a particular ability and then how that works in a particular course so that you will leave today with an understanding of this whole process of application. To start this process, first of all, we're going to ask Terry Jones to give us a brief introduction of this question of abilities, and then Lorene Belmont and Jim Mcclure will identify and define the 8 abilities that are part of the program at this time at North Idaho College. So let us start with Mr. Terry Jones.
After we finally established the goals for our general education program, we then had to look at the question, how do we know our students can actually obtain these goals? In the process of that discussion then, we moved to what are now called the general ed abilities, which are ways of obtaining the general education goals.
We have written and composed 8 general ed abilities, and we are considering a couple of others, but I will present the first 4 right now. The first one is aesthetic response. This is an ability that develops the ability to recognize the elements of design, the unifying element, the context, the purpose, and the effect of artistic works. Another ability is communication, which recognizes, sends, and responds to communications for varied audiences and purposes. Our next ability is critical, creative thinking and problem solving. Here, we analyze and evaluate information and arguments and construct a well-supported argument, selects or designs appropriate frameworks and strategies to solve problems in multiple contexts, individually and collaboratively. The historical, cultural, and global awareness ability demonstrates a basic understanding of key ideas, achievements, issues, diverse cultural views, and events on local, national, and global levels.
Our next ability is the information literacy ability. The student will be able to develop the ability to access information for a given need, develop an integrated set of skills, such as research strategies and evaluation, and to demonstrate that they have a knowledge of the tools and resources. The next ability is mathematical, scientific, and symbolic reasoning. Here students will be able to discern patterns, to make and test conjectures, to formulate counterexamples. They should be able to identify the logical path of arguments or proofs and construct simple, valid arguments. A rather difficult to access but nonetheless possible one is social responsibility and citizenship ability. This is exemplified very much in our political science program. The students can demonstrate awareness of the relationships that exist between an individual and social groups and or private or public institutions, the nature and ethics of these relationships, and the responsibilities and consequences that result from changes in these relationships. The last ability I will address here is valuing and ethical reasoning. Once again, difficult to access, but nonetheless, in many of our courses, we make an attempt to do so. The students should be able to demonstrate the ability to apply what one knows, believes, and understands towards developing an empathetic and analytical understanding of others' value perspectives. Students should be able to incorporate valuing and decision-making in multiple contexts, and those are our 8 abilities.
As you can see from this discussion we've had of identifying and defining abilities, that is stage one, I would call it, and that takes a tremendous task and time involved. And I will be discussing with our guest in a few minutes about what's magic about having 8 abilities, or they can be less or more. We will deal with that. But there are some other tasks that lie ahead of us before we do that. Our General Education Committee, as would be true of any institution, must move to the second stage, and that is to take each of these abilities, in our case 8, and to level those. And that means to look at different levels of performance for each of these abilities. It has been the task at this institution to have 4 levels of each ability. And to explain that in more precise terms for us, Edwina Stowe of the Math Department will now talk about leveling of the abilities.
Each of the 8 abilities have been leveled, put into 4 different categories that express how the student relates to different kinds of abilities that are going on. After defining each of the abilities, we went ahead and made levels that fit with each one of them. Each one of the abilities has 4 levels. We want to talk about the critical creative thinking and problem-solving ability. This is the ability that talks about analyzing and evaluating information, and then selecting and designing appropriate frameworks and strategies for solving problems. The level 1 ability involves a basic knowledge and connection to self. And so for critical creative thinking, we have a student being able to recognize that there are a variety of ways to solve problems, and then identifying one's own ways of solving problems within a given context. Level 2 involves understanding and using the knowledge and skills of a discipline within a given framework. So for this ability, it's identifying and defining the aspects or components of an argument, problem, or context situation. Level 3 is to analyze, problem solve, and or create within a given framework. Analyzing the reasoning or evidence behind various points of view is the level 3 for critical creative thinking. And then level 4 is creating new solutions or techniques for new situations through synthesis and evaluation. Level 4 critical thinking is to apply a new principle, solution, or insight to a given context or problem. Also to apply the reasoning to develop a plausible argument to support a hypothesis or thesis. And finally, evaluating one's own solution based on well-reasoned criteria.
You have just observed the content and the depth that goes into the leveling process of just one ability. We had chosen critical creative thinking and problem solving, but I would like for all of you to know that that same kind of thought and exercise went into all 8 abilities. This show does not have time with only 30 minutes to share with you the levels of all the 8 abilities, and we simply somewhat arbitrarily chose that particular one to give you the illustration of that process and what is expected from a student in that given ability if they reach through all 4 levels. And we would suggest that that would be important at a 2-year institution before that student left certain programs, and there are ways to measure that, as you can see from what was discussed by Ms. Stowe. The third stage that we would like to share with you today, and it will be done by Joyce Leiter from the English and Foreign Languages Department. She has been very successful in her application, and she's going to take a given course that she teaches at North Idaho College and show you how you can take the ability and leveling process into a given course. So at this time, I will ask Ms. Joyce Leiter to give us that course example.
5 of these 8 abilities have been identified for this particular course called FLAN 207, or Foreign Language 207, The Culture of Latin America. The first two most important abilities for this course are historical, cultural, and global awareness, and critical and creative thinking and problem solving. Listed below are some of the objectives of the course for the students. Define culture, identify the commonalities within all cultures and the principal aspects associated with Latin America, demonstrate the ability to evaluate the relative strength of a generality concerning the Latin American culture in terms of the amount of evidence substantiating the statement, to predict the possible consequences of cross-cultural encounters between Hispanic and non-Hispanic cultures. The third ability is aesthetic response, to recognize the many different forms of cultural expressions in Latin America, to explain the relationship among social questions, political issues, and literary expression in Latin America. And this ability is learned at lower levels than that previous one. Another is valuing and ethical reasoning, where a student becomes familiar with the role of the Catholic Church in the Americas and recognizes some of the tensions that the Church's activism has produced, recognizes the role of religion in adapting to local conditions and beliefs. And finally, information literacy, to demonstrate skills needed to locate and organize information about the Latin American culture from the library, the mass media, and personal observation.
Now, what we have shown you with these examples, and let me review it if I may, we identified and explained for you the 8 abilities that are presently in the general education program at North Idaho College, and then we took a particular ability and shared the 4 levels with you, and then Joyce Leiter did a wonderful job of showing you which abilities that she uses in this particular class and what she expects. And my guest, I thank you for that. That really was informative and gets into the nitty-gritty. I want to follow up with some questions now in the 15 minutes that we have left together. And Lorene Belmont is the chair of the General Education Committee. I would start with you. I want to go back and talk about how one does this, and then I'm going to have a specific question on abilities. I'm going to be rather lighthearted and suggest something that's opposite to the truth, and that is I assume that one can do this in 2 months or 3 months and put a whole program together for an institution. And I say that knowing that's not the case. Would you explain to educators in particular who are watching what kind of undertaking it is to put together such a philosophy at an institution?
Well, the philosophy, the document, the philosophy took, of course, a year or 2 even. And then we had that approved by the board of directors of the college. And from there on, it was our job to decide which abilities we wished to address. And we realized it was important that we not just select abilities from another school, because that what works for them might not work for us. And so that meant that we had to involve our entire faculty in making these decisions. So it was really a long period of discussion about what we felt these abilities should be, and it involved many, many people. We eventually broke up into smaller groups as we determined what an ability should be, so that, for instance, with the communication people, we asked those who teach English to sit down and see if they could identify what steps there are, what's a basic learning level step, and then how do you grow. And eventually we came down to the 8 abilities that we have. But having 8 abilities doesn't say that it's going to stay that way, because the next step from there was to have workshops with the faculty. And the faculty have joined us by bringing one class that they want to discuss, and they want to look at all of the abilities and see which ones they feel that they include in that class.
And then all the members of that class share those different courses and the abilities they use.
Yes, exactly. So during the process of all of this discussion, it has come to light that there may be some other abilities that we have not addressed, or there may be some abilities that we need to put together, or some that need to be taken apart. We can never say, I don't think that this document is done. But just as an example...
Like the U.S. Constitutional Living document that goes on?
Yes, right on, exactly. So, for example, a group of people in one of our workshops was very interested in our having a wellness ability. So since then a group has been formed, and they have spent a lot of time putting together an ability, putting together the levels, and presenting it to the General Ed Committee. The same has been done with an environmental ability. So these all take discussion, and this is not agreed upon by any means. It'll take many more meetings and many more, perhaps, hearings among the entire faculty to decide if we want to add these two or if we should perhaps take one away.
I'm going to go to Terry on this same thing, but before I do, are you giving advice to people who are starting this process to be patient and not to get discouraged if it takes a while? Or did I hear you also saying you don't just go to another institution and automatically take a blueprint?
It wouldn't work, because if the people here don't want it, it has to be a grassroots plan that everybody's had input in, that they really do want it this way.
Terry, I know that in some of the discussions gone over several years here that you have articulated with sophistication what your concept of abilities are, and some of your colleagues and you don't necessarily agree that something is an ability or comes in integrated to one of the other abilities or is part of the levels or goals. Would you give your definition of what you think should be encompassed in an ability and justify it being categorized as such?
Well, I think that just before I answer that question, because Lorene said something that has been a problem in the past, is we're really not trying to create something new. What we're doing, it really is re-examining the curriculum from a different standpoint. So I don't want to give the viewers the impression that we're taking and trying to find something new. I think the contention all along is that these things have been in the course, we just haven't been able to identify them.
And you want to identify them for one reason, to be able to measure them better or implement them better?
Yeah, and I think another reason is that if you as a political science teacher, the abilities cut across disciplines. So now you and I can talk about classes and not have to get tied up into our content, but the ability in which we enhance our students to be able to have in that. So it's been served twofold. In terms of defining the abilities, we have had quite a bit of discussion, and I think it's been healthy discussion, because at least from my perspective, what we don't want to do is get to the point where we're trying to do everything in one little statement, and that not everybody's going to be the same. And the wellness is a concern, I think, of all of the campus, as is the environment. And I think at least from my standpoint, my reluctance to include, well, the environment in particular, isn't because of the lack of importance of the environment, just for the consistency of what the abilities are trying to do and the philosophy's trying to do. And it's been really interesting discussion, at times heated, but I have found it been very rewarding just from the standpoint of understanding what other people feel important and how they work in their classes and how it interweaves with my classes. And as advisors on this campus, we advise students in all classes, not just in music classes, and it's been real helpful to then understand what goes on in other classes as we've had some of these discussions.
Since we've at least listed 8 here, how would you define what would an ability be? What does it need to have to be set aside as an ability?
Ooh, that's the $100 question. I think
maybe the $64,000.
Yeah, well, we're trying to do that. To me, they need to be a process by which somebody does something, and that's again part of my reluctance with the environment. Is I see that as an issue that's done with other process, and I know that there are others who disagree with that, and I don't want to seem like Ryan's the only voice, because truly, when I go into discussion, we haven't really figured out how we're going to deal with that one. But I see them as process by which we gain and can use knowledge and in a more practical kind of sort of way.
Another thing we want to get out on the table in more detail I've been using the word leveling all day on this program, and we again identified 4 levels. How does one make that determination? And let me put it another way. Is it possible that one faculty member would level different than another one, even in the same ability? That is, I guess it has something to do with the expectation of what you expect a student to arrive at a certain point. And then I'm going to do it even another way, and then just have some general discussion. If you have a student in several classes in your discipline over a 2-year period, can that student be more successful in that discipline in leveling than if you have them only for 1 semester? These are a lot of questions going in different directions, but how do we address that question and problem? Jim, would you like to start?
Well, you're going to have some variation. It certainly is up to the instructor to determine, or instructors of that particular course, to determine what particular levels they're going to teach to and what emphasis they're going to put on those particular levels. Even in the same course taught by different instructors, they might have a different method of reaching that particular, or teaching to that particular ability. One may emphasize the ability to synthesize a material more than another, who might emphasize the ability to apply it to a particular problem. So there's going to be a great deal of variation, but one thing that we do want to have in common with the same course is that they are teaching the same abilities, and that's something that the instructors are going to have to reach an agreement on. The students are having to perform up to the expectations of that particular course. So in some particular courses, there's going to be an expectation that they will maybe master a particular, say a level 3, being able to apply critical thinking skills to a problem. Whereas in another course, the expectations might be in a little different area. But overall, we're teaching at the same abilities, and I think there'll probably be more or less a consistency in the levels, even though specific courses there might be some variation.
Joyce, would you like to address that again? You've already talked on the program today about a particular course and the abilities you use.
I just was thinking about, you talked about how do we agree on the abilities and how do we come to the levels. I think one problem we've dealt with is the language itself in terms of the levels, and it's hard to get a group of faculty from various disciplines to agree that analysis means this and only that, or identification means this and not that, or this belongs at this level and not that one. And I think that's been a process that's taken a lot of time, but I think we're getting there, that we're agreeing that level 3 means this and level 2 means this, no matter what the ability is.
Please feel free to disagree with this statement. Edwin, I'm going to direct this at you. First of all, because I may be off basis, but it seems to me that some subjects, some disciplines, lend themselves to far more specific processes, that is, steps. I'm thinking of mathematics.
Certainly.
Algebra is a good example, at least when I was struggling with it. Oftentimes I was trying to understand that there are steps involved, and the faculty member I had would leave out a step, and I'd say, I'm lost, and he'd say, oh, I thought you knew that step. Whereas other subject matters are more abstract. Is that a factor that one takes into consideration in developing abilities and levels? I guess I'll say another way, is it easier in some disciplines to identify levels than in others?
I definitely think that it is. The levels in a mathematical one are fairly clear-cut, and yet some of the ones that we've had to look at, the aesthetic response one has been very difficult in some ways to come up with just exactly what do we mean, and it's been a question that we've had to revisit a lot of times.
Yes, Terry?
I was just going to say, Tony, the whole idea of leveling comes from, if you look back at some of the educational theorists, Bloom or Piaget, that believe that you create, as you learn how to become a better thinker, that there's levels involved in that and that you progress as a thinker. And so along those lines, but without trying to buy totally into that, I guess what we've decided is that hopefully if you start out at this institution, your communication skills will be at a certain level, and that your ability to communicate will be enhanced, or you would become a better communicator over your time spent here. So I think it's, again, it gets back to in the present circles of education, they talk about, well, students start with this kind of skill level or ability level, and they end here, and what we were trying to do is see if they actually have made progress along those lines. So it's not a totally new concept as of, I mean, Bloom and Piaget have been around for a long time, and I think that what we've tried to do and found difficulty doing is what, like you said, different words mean different things in different subjects, and I think the conversation has been very rewarding, and as we sit down and say, well, what does it mean to have a level 1 expectation? And I think that in my own course what it's done is that a lot of times as thinkers in our own disciplines, we like to deal with the synthesis and the big picture questions, and with our students we need to make sure that we give them the kinds of information that allow them to talk about the big questions and not just jump to them. And I found that in examining my own courses, sometimes I jump to those big synthesis kinds of questions, and so it's been a real, it's a process that is difficult because of the disciplines have been so separate in the past.
Lorene and Josh, you are in a discipline where there's already been very great thought given in detail to measurements and that deal with levels. I'm thinking of English composition in particular. My basic question is, knowing that you expect certain things to get through English composition, like 103, 104 at this institution is numbered, and there is an exam at the end of English 1, competency exam. Do you expect every student to get through levels, or can some students accomplish more levels in a course than another student, and still both of them succeed in that course?
Ooh, that's a tricky question, because that involves a lot to do with graduation requirements and all the nitty-gritty administrative things. And I'm not sure we've totally dealt with that. One way we've tried to deal with it is we don't have mandatory placement here, but we do test students, and assessment is very much a part of the general education program. So if we assess a student and put him or her into the correct class, then there's a reasonable idea that they will achieve to that level.
I've been given the signal we're out of time. We're just getting started. I want to thank my colleagues, all 5 of you, for being here for 2 weeks to discuss, ladies and gentlemen, what has been called the General Education Program, or a reform movement. I hope you found it as stimulating as I have, as my colleagues have been most informative, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, and we'll move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.